The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood. In the distant horizon, the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the ruined battlefield. The war had been raging for weeks, and humanity's chances of survival grew slimmer with each passing day. The alien forces had overwhelmed the planet, crushing every resistance in their path. Earth's last defense was the ragtag group of soldiers, struggling to hold on to the little land they still had. David was a soldier, a part of that last line of defense. His mission had been simple: protect the base at all costs. But as the alien warships loomed overhead, he realized that no matter how hard they fought, they were going to lose. The last hope of humanity lay in the survival of a few hundred survivors, civilians and soldiers alike. And for David, that meant risking everything to protect them. He stumbled into the wreckage of a once proud city, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The streets were littered with debris, and the ground was charred from the bombings. His boots crunched as he walked past the remains of fallen soldiers, both human and alien, who had lost their lives in the brutal conflict. The world he knew was slipping away, and all that remained was the cold reality of war. David's radio crackled to life, pulling him from his thoughts. "Soldier, we've got something you need to see." He quickly made his way to the coordinates provided by his commanding officer. When he arrived, he found something that made his heart skip a beat. There, lying in the middle of the street, was an alien woman. She was unlike any alien he had ever seen. Her skin shimmered in the dimming light, and her eyes, strangely human, stared at him, full of pain and fear. David knelt beside her. "What happened?" he asked, his voice rough from the dust and smoke. The alien woman coughed weakly, her body bruised and battered. She was clearly injured, barely clinging to life. I was abandoned," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The war. They left me ... left me to die." David had heard of such things: alien prisoners, slaves discarded by their own kind when they were no longer useful. He had seen the horrors of war firsthand, but this was different. There was something about her that didn't sit right. Her presence felt ... important. She wasn't like the other aliens he had fought against. "Don't worry, I'll get you." "Help," he said, lifting her into his arms. He didn't know why, but he couldn't just leave her there. The survival of humanity might depend on sacrifices, but this woman, this alien, didn't deserve to die alone. The woman winced in his arms but didn't resist. As David carried her back to the base, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a strange energy about her, an aura of power that seemed to hum in the air around them. When they reached the base, David laid her down in a makeshift medical tent. The medics rushed to her side, scanning her for injuries. But something else caught David's attention: a strange device on her wrist. A mark that seemed to glimmer with a strange, almost regal symbol. As the medics worked, David couldn't help but stare at the symbol. It was too familiar. He had seen it before, back in the early days of the war, during the initial alien invasions. It belonged to the royal family of an alien species, one of the most powerful factions in the galaxy. Could she be? His thoughts were interrupted as the woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. David leaned closer. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman blinked, clearly disoriented. Then, her eyes locked onto his with a fierce intensity. "I am Princess Seraphina of the Zinther Empire," she said, her voice still weak but carrying an undeniable authority. "And you, human, have made a grave mistake." David's heart raced as the realization hit him. The woman he had saved, the one he had taken in out of compassion, was no ordinary alien. She wasn't a helpless prisoner. She was a princess, a leader in the alien empire responsible for the war. Her people had waged this conflict, and now he had unknowingly accepted her as payment for his service. A wave of anger and disbelief. crashed over him. He had just taken in the enemy, and in doing so, he had unknowingly allied himself with the very forces that sought to destroy humanity. But as he looked at her, vulnerable, injured, he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. The medics continued to work on her, and David stood back, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't just let her die, but he couldn't allow her to be a threat either. He had just become involved in a game far larger than he had ever imagined, and now he had to navigate it. Princess Seraphine's eyes narrowed as she sensed his unease. "You don't understand, do you, human?" she said, her voice now steady, almost regal. "I am not your enemy. I was sent here to negotiate to end this war." David frowned. "Negotiate? With who? Your people have destroyed everything we have. They've killed billions of us." Seraphina sighed, her expression softening. "The war was never my choice. I was forced into it. But now I am here to offer you something your people can never have. Peace." David felt a chill run down his spine. "And why would you do that? After everything?" "Because," she said, her gaze unwavering, "I no longer have an empire to return to." Her words left a weight in the air. David had no idea what she meant by that, but one thing was certain. The war was far from over, and he had just become part of something much larger than he had ever imagined. The night settled over the base like a heavy cloak, the distant sounds of war still echoing through the thick silence. Inside the dimly lit medical tent, Princess Seraphina lay on a bed, her breathing steady but labored. David paced restlessly, unable to shake the weight of what had just happened. She wasn't just any alien, she was a royal. A princess from an empire that had enslaved countless species, including humans. Yet here she was, in his care, at his mercy. David couldn't understand it. The war had torn his world apart, and now this alien princess was claiming that she wanted peace. But how could he believe her? Could someone who represented the very force that sought humanity's destruction really change their mind? And why? Would she risk her life for such a thing? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of movement. He turned to find Seraphine's eyes open again, her gaze clear but distant. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice fragile but filled with authority. "I shouldn't have burdened you with this. But you must understand the Zinther Empire. It is not what you think." David hesitated, stepping closer to the bed. "You're saying you didn't want this war? Your people invaded us, killed millions. What's left to say?" Her expression hardened for a moment, and then she sighed, her face crumpling with emotion. "It was never supposed to be like this. I was forced into this position, into this war by my father. He was obsessed with conquering new territories, new resources. I didn't agree with it, but as a princess, my opinion meant nothing." David couldn't help but stare. It was hard to imagine someone like her, so elegant, so poised, being forced into something so brutal. The image he had of the alien invaders, cold and merciless, now seemed distant and unfounded. Seraphina took a deep breath. "When my father died, I was left to pick up the pieces of a broken empire. But there were those who wanted war, those who didn't care about peace, only power." Her voice wavered slightly. "I was powerless, so I fled to escape the bloodshed." David took a step back, his mind racing. You fled your own people?" She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with regret. "I wasn't prepared for what would happen after I left. The war didn't stop. It only grew worse without me. And now, I'm nothing but a fugitive, a princess with no crown, no power. I'm the one they abandoned, discarded like I was worthless." David's gaze softened. He wasn't sure if he should trust her. But there was something about her story, something that made him hesitate. Her pain seemed genuine. He could see it in her eyes. "So you came to Earth to end the war?" David asked, still unsure whether this was some kind of trap. I came to negotiate with your leaders, she answered softly. I wanted to stop the killing. I thought if I could show them that I was different, that I wasn't like the rest of my people, maybe they would listen. But things went wrong. My transport was ambushed and I was left for dead. And now you're the only one who can help me. David stood there, processing what she had said. His thoughts were a whirlwind. How could she have been abandoned by her own people? Why? Would she come to Earth, risk everything, only to be left to die? And what was it that she wanted from him? He was just a soldier, a small cog in this massive war. How could he be the one to decide the fate of a galaxy? You've been on your own for so long, David said, his voice quiet. I can't promise you anything. I don't even know if your people will listen to me, or if they'd even care about what you have to say. They've already shown us that they don't value life or lives, at least. Seraphine's eyes narrowed, a flicker of resolve igniting within them. Then it's up to you to decide if humanity is worth saving or if we're doomed to repeat history, to let war destroy everything in its path. David felt a chill spread through him. He hadn't signed up for this. He wasn't a diplomat or a politician. He was just trying to survive. But standing here, looking into the eyes of the alien princess who had sacrificed everything for peace, something inside him stirred. Was this his chance to make a difference? Was he really the one who could turn the tide of this war? Seraphine's voice broke through his thoughts. I understand if you can't help me, but you are the only one who knows the truth. You're the only one who can show your people that we can still choose a different path, a path away from destruction. David looked at her, his mind a blur of doubt and hope. Could he trust her? Could he risk everything on someone who might have been playing him all along? But deep down, he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away, not when there was still a chance for peace. I'll help you, he said, his voice steady. But we'll need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more your people will destroy. Seraphina gave him a small, grateful smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She knew as well as he did that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be dangerous, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. But in that moment, David made a choice. He had stepped into something far greater than he had ever expected, and now there was no turning back. The war was far from over, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could end it together. The days that followed were tense and filled with uncertainty. The medical tent had become a place of constant movement, as David and the others worked tirelessly to keep Seraphina alive. Her injuries were severe, but not fatal. Despite the physical pain, she seemed to carry the weight of her people's future on her fragile shoulders. David couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope. One wrong move and everything could come crashing down. The others in the base were skeptical about Seraphine's motives, and David couldn't blame them. She was an alien, a princess, no less, from the empire that had decimated their world. How could anyone trust her, especially after everything they had been through? But as the days went on, David found himself increasingly drawn to her. There was something about her that was unlike any enemy he had encountered. She was vulnerable, yes, but she was also strong, a leader in her own right. She had endured unimaginable hardships, and now, with humanity's fate hanging in the balance, she was willing to risk it all to end the war. One evening, as David stood guard outside the medical tent, he couldn't help but think about everything Seraphina had told him. The story of her escape from the Zinther Empire, her desire for peace, it all seemed so genuine. But could it be true? Was she really different from the rest of her people, or was she simply a clever ploy to manipulate him and his comrades into lowering their guard? The cold wind whipped through the base, making David pull his coat tighter around himself. He hadn't had a good night's sleep in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the war, the destruction, the chaos. The faces of the fallen soldiers haunted him. He couldn't afford to rest. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Suddenly the sound of footsteps behind him broke his thoughts. He turned to find Serafina standing there, her eyes still tired but determined. She was dressed in the simple uniform they had given her, but there was a certain elegance to her presence, even in this stripped-down form. "I need to speak with you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the weariness that clung to her. David nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. "Of course, what is it?" Serafina walked a few steps toward the edge of the base where the lights were dimmer and the noise of the war seemed farther away. The stars twinkled above, an eerie reminder of how small they all were in the grand scheme of things. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice carrying a weight that made David pause. "You were right about one thing. This is dangerous. You're taking a huge risk by trusting me, and I know you're not sure whether you should. But there's more at stake than you realize." David felt a chill run through him. "What do you mean?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "The Zinther Empire. They're not just a military force. They're a political machine. And when my father died, a power struggle began. The factions within the Empire are at war with each other, and now they'll do anything control. They see me as a threat. As long as I'm alive, there's a chance that I could unite the Empire, bring peace. But the other factions, they want me dead." David's mind raced. "So you think your people would come after you, even now?" Serafina nodded, her face hardening. "I'm not just some fugitive. I'm a symbol, and for the ones who want war, I'm an obstacle. If they learn I'm still alive, they'll stop at nothing to capture me, to silence me. And if they know you've taken me in—" She trailed off, her voice thick with the implication. David clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. It wasn't just a matter of humanity's survival anymore. It was a battle for the future of the Zinther Empire, and Serafina was caught in the middle. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Serafina took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "We move quickly. I need to get a message to my people, a message that I'm not their enemy, that I can end this war if they'll let me. But we can't do it from here. It's too dangerous." David was silent for a moment, weighing her words. The thought of leaving the base, of risking everything to cross enemy lines, filled him with unease. But he had promised to help her. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he wanted to believe that she was sincere. "You're right," he said finally. "We can't stay here. But where do we go?" Seraphine's eyes darkened with resolve. "I have a place, a hidden location far from here. It's secure. If we can get there, I can send a message to the factions within my empire. A chance for peace. But we'll need to move fast and we'll need to be careful. They'll be looking for me." David nodded, already formulating a plan in his mind. It wouldn't be easy. They would have to navigate treacherous terrain, avoid detection, and outrun any enemies that might be tracking them. But it was their best shot. "We leave at dawn," he said, his voice firm. "Get some rest. We'll need all the energy we can muster." Serafina didn't argue. She simply nodded and turned back toward the medical tent. But before she entered, she paused and looked over her shoulder at David. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. "I know you're risking everything for me. For all of us." David met her gaze, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. "It's not just for you," he said, his voice low. "It's for all of us. If we don't try, then what's the point?" And with that, the two of them silently prepared for the journey ahead. It was a journey into the unknown, one that could either end the war or ensure humanity's doom. Either way, they would face it together. The dawn came quickly, the pale light of the morning sun casting long shadows over the deserted base. The quiet was unsettling, as if the world was holding its breath. David stood at the edge of the camp, watching the first rays of sunlight break through the dark clouds that had hung over them for weeks. There was a chill in the air, and the sounds of distant explosions and gunfire still echoed faintly in the background. Serafina stood beside him, dressed in a simple tactical suit that was far removed from the luxurious garments she had worn as a princess. Her eyes, though tired, burned with a fierce determination. The weight of the decision they had made the night before was still heavy in the air, but there was no turning back now. "We're ready," David said, his voice steady, though his mind was anything but. He had never been in a situation like this before, leading a fugitive princess through enemy lines, with nothing but the hope that she could end a war they had all been losing. Serafina nodded, a quiet resolve in her eyes. "We need to be quick. Once we leave the camp, we'll be exposed. There's no telling how long we'll have before the enemy realizes I'm gone." David glanced over his shoulder at the base one last time. The soldiers and medics were still preparing for the next phase of their defense, oblivious to the mission he was about to undertake. He knew that what he was doing could cost them all their lives, but he had already made his choice. "Let's move," he said, signaling to the small group that had been assembled to help them. It was a diverse team: soldiers, engineers, and medics, each one risking their lives to help Serafina. They had all been part of the last hope for humanity, and now they were staking everything on the chance that peace was possible. They set off quickly, moving through the abandoned city outskirts and into the dense forests beyond. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the remnants of battle. Buildings that had once stood proud now lay in ruins, their shells nothing more than hollowed-out structures. The further they went from the base, the more they felt the weight of their decision pressing down on them. David stayed close to Serafina, his hand always near his weapon, ready for any attack. The journey was treacherous, winding paths through thick forests, steep ravines, and narrow passes. Every step brought them closer to their goal, but also deeper into enemy territory. They knew that if they were spotted, it would be the end. By midday, they had made it to the edge of a small mountain range. The air was colder here, the wind biting through their clothing. Serafina had told them that the hidden location they were seeking was just beyond the mountain pass, in a secluded valley where she had once trained as a child. But the closer they got, the more David felt the unease creeping in. The air around them seemed to change, heavy with the tension of being so close to their destination yet so vulnerable. It was as if something was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They stopped briefly to catch their breath and reassess their surroundings. David scanned the horizon, his senses alert. The wind carried no sounds other than the rustling of the trees and the faint hum of distant technology. There was no sign of movement, no indication of an approaching enemy. But David knew better than to trust the silence. Serafina turned to him, her expression grim. "We're close now. We can't afford any mistakes." David nodded. "I know. Just keep moving and stay low. We'll make it." As they began to climb the narrow path leading through the mountain pass, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the eerie silence or the distant sounds of battle. There was a shift in the air, a change he couldn't explain. The closer they got to their destination, the more he felt like they were walking into a trap, without warning. A loud crack split the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of blaster fire. David's heart raced as he instinctively pulled Serafina behind a boulder for cover. The team scrambled to find shelter, their weapons drawn as they tried to pinpoint The source of the attack. Stay down. David hissed, his hand tightly gripping his weapon. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Seraphine's breath quickened as she peered over the rock. "They found us," she said, her voice sharp with fear and determination. "It's my people agents sent to stop me." David cursed under his breath. The last thing they needed was a direct confrontation with the Zinther Empire's soldiers. They had no chance of winning a fight against such overwhelming force, not with so few of them, and certainly not when they were out in the open. "We need to keep moving," David said, his mind racing for a solution. "We can't afford to fight them here. If we stay, they'll have us cornered." Seraphina hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But if we run, we risk losing everything." "I can't let them catch me." David grabbed her arm firmly. "We don't have a choice. Trust me, we're not going to lose this fight, but we need to get to safety first." Without waiting for a response, David signaled to the team to move out. They darted down the path, running as fast as they could. Blaster shots continued to fly past them, narrowly missing their marks. The sound of pursuit was deafening, but David didn't dare look back. He had to focus on getting them to safety, getting Seraphina to that hidden location, no matter the cost. As they rounded a bend in the path, David saw a glimpse of the valley Seraphina had mentioned. It was their destination, a narrow stretch of land surrounded by high cliffs, with a small hidden bunker tucked beneath the rocks. It was their only hope, but they weren't alone. Emerging from the shadows ahead of them were figures that David knew all too well. The Zinther soldiers had gotten ahead of them, and now they were blocking the entrance to the valley. "Time to make a choice," David muttered as the group came to a halt. They were trapped, with no clear way out. And behind them, the rest of the enemy forces were closing in. Seraphina stepped forward, her face set in stone. "We make a stand," she said, her voice cold. "It's now or never." The air was thick with tension as David and his team stood at the edge of the valley, the Zinther soldiers closing in from the front while the distant sound of more reinforcements echoed through the cliffs. There was no way forward and no way back. They were surrounded, and the weight of their choices hung heavy on them all. David's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to think of a way out. His instincts screamed at him to fight, to take down as many of the enemy as he could before they were overwhelmed. But that wouldn't solve anything. They needed to survive not just for themselves, but for the chance of peace that Seraphina represented. "Stay calm," David muttered under his breath, trying to steady his nerves. He turned to Seraphina, who stood a few paces ahead of him, her face a mask of resolve. "You were right," David said, his voice low. "We don't have a choice. We have, to make a stand here." Seraphina nodded, her eyes steely with determination. "If we can hold them off long enough, I can send the message. It's the only chance we have. But you need to get to that bunker. You can't afford to waste time fighting me." David hesitated. "And you? What happens to you?" Her lips tightened into a thin line. "I'll do what I can. I may be a fugitive, but I'm not powerless. We've come too far to back down now." He nodded, understanding the unspoken words between them. There was no more room for doubt. This was their moment. Whether they succeeded or failed, they had to make it count. David turned to the team, his voice commanding. "We'll make a defensive perimeter around the entrance. You on the left," he gestured to one of the soldiers, "and you on the right. Stay hidden as long as you can. As soon as they make their move, we fight. We fight until we give Seraphina the time she needs." The soldiers nodded, quickly moving into position. David and Seraphina took their place in the center, where the terrain offered some cover but also limited their mobility. The steep cliffs on both sides made it difficult for the enemy to flank them. But it also meant they were trapped in a narrow choke point. The first blaster shot rang out, the unmistakable hum of alien weaponry cutting through the air. David ducked instinctively, pulling Serafina down with him. The enemy had opened fire, and the battle had begun. Shots flew overhead, striking the rocky ground with explosive force. The sound of blaster fire was deafening, and the flashes of light from the shots created an almost surreal scene as the shadows danced across the narrow valley. David gritted his teeth, trying to stay focused. His team was already firing back, but they were outnumbered, and it wouldn't be long before the Zinther soldiers advanced. The enemy soldiers didn't waste time on caution. They came at them in waves, their blasters crackling as they attempted to flush out the defenders. David fired back, his shots accurate and precise, but it wasn't enough to hold them off for long. He could hear Serafina behind him, issuing orders in her own language to her people, rallying them, keeping them fighting. For a moment, the battle was chaotic, and time seemed to slow. David could feel his muscles aching from the constant tension, his heart racing with every new wave of enemy soldiers. But amidst the chaos, he could also see the small glimmers of hope. His soldiers were holding their ground, pushing back the aliens bit by bit. And Serafina was doing more than just surviving, she was leading them, guiding them through the madness. Then, just as it seemed like the enemy would break through, Seraphine's voice rose above the chaos. "I've sent the message," she shouted, her voice unwavering. "Now we hold them back. We'll win this battle, and they'll understand. This is the turning point." David didn't know how, but he trusted her. He had seen the fire in her eyes, and he knew that no matter how hard they fought, they couldn't afford to let the Zinther Empire destroy what they were trying to build. The enemy soldiers were regrouping, preparing for another charge. David's mind raced. They didn't have much time left. If they could just hold them off a little longer, maybe, just maybe, this would be the breakthrough they needed. A loud explosion shook the ground, and David was thrown to the ground, his vision spinning. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a moment, he couldn't hear anything except the ringing in his ears. He pushed himself to his knees, gasping for breath, his hand clutching the rocky earth for support. "David!" Seraphine's voice called to him through the haze. "We need to move, now!" He blinked, struggling to clear his vision, but he saw her, a silhouette in the smoke standing tall, her hand outstretched toward him. Without thinking, David grabbed her hand, pulling himself up. "Let's go," she urged, her voice sharp with urgency. The rest of the team had already begun retreating toward the hidden bunker, firing behind them as they moved. David grabbed his weapon, ready to follow, but the enemy wasn't giving up. More soldiers were pushing forward, and their weapons were deadly accurate. "Move!" David shouted, pushing Serafina ahead of him. The soldiers covered them as best as they could, their blasters lighting up the path in front of them. The bunker was so close, just a few hundred meters away. It was their last chance. Another explosion rang out, sending rocks flying in all directions. David felt the heat of the blast on his back, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not now. Not when they were so close to their goal. Serafina was ahead of him, her strides long and sure. Her face was set, determined. David couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Here was a princess, once the heir to a vast empire, now leading the charge for peace in a war that had cost so much. She was no longer just the enemy. She was a symbol, a chance for redemption. With one final push, they reached the entrance of the bunker, ducking inside as the soldiers fired their final shots. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, sealing them in. They were safe for now, but David knew this was just the beginning. Whatever happened next, they had to survive. They had to make it to the end, for humanity, for Serafina, for everyone. The battle was far from over, but this was their first victory. and it was enough to keep hope alive. The cold walls of the bunker surrounded them, but inside, the tension was palpable. The heavy door had sealed shut behind them with a deafening thud, and the air inside felt stale, thick with the weight of their escape. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. David leaned against the cold metal of the wall, his breath ragged from the run. His heart still pounded in his chest, his mind racing through the chaos they had just left behind. They had made it to the bunker, yes, but it was a fragile victory. Their enemies were still out there, and the war was far from over. Serafina stood a few paces away, her eyes scanning the room. The bunker was small, dimly lit, and appeared to be long abandoned. There were supplies scattered about, crates of old technology and other remnants of whatever military operation had once taken place here. The walls were lined with monitors, some broken, others blinking with static dot, but it wasn't the state of the bunker that occupied Seraphine's mind. It was what came next. David straightened, rubbing his shoulder. "We made it," he said, his voice rough. "But we can't stay here for long. How long until your message reaches your people?" Serafina didn't immediately answer. Instead, she moved toward one of the monitors, brushing off the dust that had accumulated over the years. She tapped a few keys, her fingers moving quickly over the ancient console. The screen flickered to life, showing lines of alien script that David couldn't understand. But Seraphine's expression was unreadable, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I've sent the message," she said at last, her voice steady, though tinged with an edge of uncertainty. "But ... it will take time for them to respond. My people, the factions within the Empire, are divided. They don't trust each other, and they won't trust me easily." David nodded, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. "How long? How much time do we have before they come looking for you again?" Serafina looked up at him, her eyes tired but resolute. "It could take hours, maybe days. It depends on how quickly they receive the transmission and decide to act on it." David ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. "That's not good enough. We don't have days. We need to move fast." "We're not alone," Serafina said, her voice quieter now. "I still have allies within the Empire loyalists who want peace. But they're few. The rest of the Empire's leaders, the warmongers, they will never allow this to happen without resistance." David glanced around the bunker. "So what's our next move? We're stuck here for now, and we're not in a position to fight another battle." Seraphine's eyes narrowed, her expression becoming hard with resolve. "I can't fight the war alone. But I can't just hide either. The message is a start, but we need to meet with my allies. I've given them the coordinates to this location. If they receive the message, they'll come for us. But we have to make sure we're ready. We can't afford to make any mistakes." David absorbed her words. "All right, so we wait for them. But we stay sharp. We keep ourselves hidden, and we prepare. If anyone comes through those doors, we need to be ready." The team gathered in the small space, setting up makeshift defenses. It was clear they weren't going to get much rest, not with so many unanswered questions. Serafina was right. They had to be prepared for whatever came next. But the weight of their isolation was pressing on him. They were on their own now. No allies, no backup. Just the hope that Seraphine's message would reach the right ears. The hours passed slowly, each one marked by the soft hum of the bunker's lights and the distant sound of explosions in the background, an ongoing reminder that the war wasn't over. The tension in the small space felt like a pressure that would crush them if they weren't careful. David kept his eyes on the monitors, watching for any signs of movement, any indication that the message had been received or that they were about to be discovered. But nothing came. The silence in the bunker stretched on, oppressive, filled with uncertainty. As the night wore on, fatigue began to settle over him. He sat down on a crate, his rifle resting against his knee, staring blankly at the wall. The adrenaline that had kept him sharp during the escape had begun to fade, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. But he couldn't afford to sleep. Not yet. Not while they were still so vulnerable. "David," Seraphine's voice broke the silence. He turned to find her standing across from him, her gaze focused on the screen once more. "I need you to understand something," she said quietly. "The factions within the Empire, they may not listen to me. The warlords, the generals, they will see my survival as a threat to their power. They'll stop at nothing to silence me." David stood up, walking toward her. "Then we stop them first," he said, his voice steady. "We get you to those allies, and we convince them that you're the way forward. If we can't make them listen, then we make them see it, even if we have to fight." Seraphina shook her head slightly, as if weighing his words. "It won't be that simple. You don't understand the politics of my people. They would rather destroy everything than lose their grip on power." David clenched his fists. "Then we make sure they don't have the chance." There was a long pause before Seraphina spoke again. Her eyes softened, the hardness fading just slightly. "You don't understand, David. Even if we win, even if we bring peace, there will be those who will never accept it. The war will never be truly over." David stared at her for a moment, his heart heavy. "We fight anyway," he said quietly, "because it's better than doing nothing. And if it means a chance for peace, then we don't stop." Seraphine's eyes held his for a moment longer. Then she nodded, her face returning to that familiar mask of resolve. "Then we fight, together." With that, the silence in the bunker became a little less oppressive, replaced by the understanding that they were in this together. No matter what came next, they would face it side by side. And for the first time in a long while, David allowed himself to believe that they might just have a chance. The bunker was quiet, almost eerily so. The silence stretched long, filled with the anticipation of what was to come. Every moment felt heavy, as if the universe itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. David stood near the entrance, his rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the barren landscape outside. The weight of their isolation pressed down on him, but his mind refused to rest. They had done everything they could. The message had been sent. Seraphina had gathered her allies within the Zinther Empire, and now they were waiting. But for how long? The question gnawed at David. How long could they keep their position hidden? How long could they hold out before the forces aligned against them overwhelmed them once more? Seraphina, sitting on a crate nearby, was deep in thought, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. Her eyes were fixed on the monitors, watching the static-filled screens, waiting for the signal, for any sign that her allies were on their way. "We can't keep waiting like this," David said finally, breaking the silence. He turned from the window, his gaze meeting hers. "If they're not coming, we need to make our move." Seraphine's gaze never wavered from the screen, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the quiet hang between them, as if considering the gravity of his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but filled with a weight David had come to understand. "We wait," she said simply. "It's all we can do for now." David's frustration flared, but he kept it under control. "We can't just wait here, hoping they show up. The longer we stay, the more time the other factions have to close in. If they find us first—" "I know," Seraphina interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "But I've made my choice. We hold this position until my allies come. If we leave now, we risk losing everything. If we stay, we risk everything too. But I have no other choice. We wait." David could see it in her eyes, the fierce determination, the refusal to give up. She was willing to sacrifice everything for the possibility of peace, even if it meant risking her life and the lives of everyone in the bunker. The weight of her resolve hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he said nothing. As the day stretched on, the waiting continued. The hours passed slowly, each one marked by the soft beeping of the monitors and the distant sounds of the ongoing war outside. But there was no word from Seraphon's allies, no sign of movement beyond the bunker. Then, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the barren landscape, something changed. The monitors flickered, a faint signal breaking through the static. David immediately stepped forward, his heart racing as he watched Seraphon's face. "Is that?" he began, but she held up a hand, silencing him. She leaned closer to the screen, her eyes scanning the data that appeared. The signal was weak, but it was unmistakably a message from her allies. "They're coming," Seraphina said quietly, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. "They've received the transmission. They're on their way." David's heart skipped a beat, the relief flooding through him in an instant. "Finally," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "We're not alone." Seraphina stood, her face resolute. "No, we're not, but it's not over yet. There's still more to do. We can't afford to let our guard down now." David nodded, his mind shifting into the familiar focus of a soldier. "We prepare. We make sure we're ready when they arrive." "But—" Seraphon's next words stopped him in his tracks. "I'm not sure we can win this," she said, her voice quiet but filled with the weight of the truth. "The factions within the Empire are fractured, yes. But there are still those who will fight to the death to stop us. Even if we succeed in this moment, there's no guarantee that the war will end. There's no guarantee that peace will come." David felt a chill run down his spine. For a moment, the hope he had clung to wavered, replaced by the harsh reality of the world they were in. The war wasn't just a battle between two sides. It was a battle for the future, for the survival of countless lives, and no matter how hard they fought, the outcome was uncertain. But then he looked at Seraphina, standing there in the dim light of the bunker, her expression unyielding. She wasn't ready to give up, not now. Not when there was still a chance. And neither was he. "We do what we can," he said, his voice steady. "We fight for this chance, for peace, for the future. And we don't stop until we've done everything we can to make it happen." Seraphina met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "And that's enough. For now, that's all we can do." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed outside the bunker, and David's pulse quickened. The moment had arrived. Seraphon's allies were here, and with them came the possibility of peace. The chance to end the war once and for all. David turned to his team, giving them a brief nod. "Get ready. They're here." The door to the bunker opened with a hiss, revealing the silhouettes of Seraphon's allies. They were a small group, but their presence was enough to ignite a spark of hope in David's chest. This was the moment they had fought for, the moment they had risked everything for. Seraphina stepped forward, her face calm but resolute. She greeted her allies with a quiet nod, but there was no time for celebration. The work wasn't done yet. The negotiations, the peace talks, they all had to happen now. Before it was too late. David stood at her side, his heart still heavy but filled with a new sense of purpose. He had no illusions that peace would come easily. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and sacrifices. But in that moment, as Seraphina and her allies began to discuss their next steps, David realized something. They had come this far, and that was something worth fighting for. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, David felt that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance.